Time for another Patreon question. Hi Mallen, what's your take on Peter Zeihan's analysis stroke predictions on the imminent 10 years collapse of the Chinese economy and birth rate crisis spelling the end of globalization? Short, medium and long term, are these ultimately good for local economies being more self-reliant, and will shorter supply chains and a more seasonal approach to agriculture be good for our global carbon footprint? The questioner didn't provide a link to the analysis being referenced, so I can't speak to the detail of what prompted the question. But let's talk a bit around the theme here, because the Chinese demographic issue is certainly a huge spoiler for its rise to the top of the world power stakes. Right now, on most of the measures that Ray Dalio notes as being the historic formula by which great powers rise and fall, then China is clearly on the way up. Competitiveness is good, investment in education, technology, building up military power, having a strong sense of purpose and leadership. All of those things are going the right way. China does have more debt than it would like to have at this point in the cycle. We might come back to that. The great power it's seeking to replace, United States, clearly on the way down. Polarized and divided society, declining standards in education, low levels of competitiveness, and so on. These are factors that were predictors for the rise and fall of the Dutch Empire, the rise and fall of the British Empire, and the rise and the current decline of the United States. However, there are some things in the current situation and the modern world that we've never seen before. Not in the whole of human history. Those novelties are not always on the face of it great news, but in one sense they might be, because they signal that we're not doomed simply to repeat the cycles of history. Even if it is still the most likely path, there is a chance to write a new script. The Chinese population level is one of these, and actually a really rather important one. Every new world power, certainly in relatively recent history, built its position and wealth against the backdrop of a relatively rapidly growing population that was emerging from poverty. But the projections are that for China, and indeed for many of the rest of us in the world, by the way, those levels are plateauing and starting to decline, but more precipitously in China. While that's just starting to happen in terms of overall human numbers there, they've just plateaued. Because the birth rate was brought down so significantly decades ago, initially by the one-child policy, that is about to appear pretty quickly in the expected decline of China's working age population. We don't know if it's possible for a country to become a global number one power while its population shrinks. We've never seen this before. But bear in mind, there are some other things we've not seen before as well. We've not seen artificial intelligence and mechanization at the level that we have it now. It is entirely possible that part of the process of dealing with declining human populations generically is going to be the transfer of productivity to technology. We've also not seen the situation where we have so many ways to devastate our societies if we get into conflict, with a move with AI into warfighting technology, for instance. Nevertheless, the debt level in China is higher than you would expect. The autocratic government regime is guaranteed a degree of error, inefficiency and corruption, because such things come hand in glove with systems that have too few checks and balances. So even though the US seems determinedly on the self-destruction route, there is no guarantee that China simply sails to the top. That said, I don't go with dramatic pronouncements as such that the Chinese economy will collapse in 10 years. Whenever you get overblown language around collapses and catastrophes, you should suspect at least a little dramatization in the name of clickbait. China has a huge amount of economic development going on, a large amount of investment that is very strategically being focused on the technologies of the future, still has one of the largest populations in the world. They will clearly, unless they have a political implosion, which seems unlikely in the short term, I tend to think inevitable in the long term, but anyway, they will clearly be a major economic force in the world over the coming decades. They may be considerably constrained from where they would have been because of this demographic shift. That's not the same as collapse. And you can see that various groupings are coming to this conclusion. The European Union, for instance, and some of its constituent countries that have stepped away from the confrontational stance of the United States and made clear noises about pursuing a new positive relationship with China. That is happening because power is shifting in the world. Those politicians are slowly coming to terms with the implications of that. Will we see collapse and the end to globalization? The black and white extremes, I would say no. Globalization is inevitable with the technology and the experience of the world today. It may come in waves, it may advance and retreat according to political fashion. I just don't believe it can now come to an end. Too much of the world's economy is embedded into global trade. Too many have incentives to keep it that way. And regardless what the public statements of politicians may be, when they follow the short-term incentives, they will ultimately go broadly in the same direction, because that's where the logic takes them. This is all presupposing we can avoid any kind of catastrophic global conflict, in the aftermath of which all bets would be off. So to reiterate, no, I don't think we'll see Chinese collapse. We will see setbacks. We will see them struggle to establish the UN, for instance, as the new global reserve currency. We will see them frustrated by various barriers that the US will erect to their success while it's in the process of gradually losing ground. And we will see them struggle in the face of demographic change, yes. But ultimately, it's not as though they couldn't solve that problem almost at a stroke if they wanted to. China, after all, heavily constrains immigration. Largely, if Xi Jinping's words to Joe Biden are taken at face value, because they place a huge importance on the racial purity of their own population. China has no interest in becoming a US-style melting pot of nationalities. Given the obsession with race that's gripping the US, it's not hard to see how they would rationalise that as an asset in their favour. And this doesn't just come from the leadership. When there was a proposal 3 years ago to make it easier for rich or skilled foreigners to gain residency, there was a populist backlash, with men stepping forward promising to protect Chinese women from the immigrants should they arrive. So it comes down to where self-interest takes them. If they really faced collapse, they could open up to immigration, because as the emerging world power, with many more manufacturing jobs than they have young people to fill them, they would be a highly attractive destination for immigrants, as of course America has been over the years. Official estimates, by the way, are that China will have 30 million manufacturing jobs unfilled within the next 2 years. But if they hold to the view, as I think they will, that the benefits are not worth the disruption to their idea of themselves and their society, then you will see short-term fixes. Some jobs will be exported, some will be automated, some will just go unfilled, and they will be a constraint on Chinese economic power. But ultimately, the change that's coming to the world is that we will live in a bipolar world, not a unipolar one. We will all mostly have to come to terms with demographic change. China will be more assertive and a player in all the global controversies and power struggles. Its values will be challenging our own in lots of different ways, with our assumptions and theirs coming into conflict with increasing frequency. That's not going to change. Remember, for China to emerge as the dominant world power, it doesn't have to grow beyond where America is now. It simply has to keep growing at all, or even stay the same while America keeps declining. And America can't stop itself from declining because it's loaded itself down with eye-watering amounts of debt. It's polarised, its leadership is weak, regardless of which party gets elected. There is no example in history of a world power that entered that phase and didn't decline out of its dominant position. So it may be that in a bipolar world we see less strength, less stability than we used to. Everyone is a bit weaker. Population demographics, the destructive power of modern discourse aided by technology, to wit the internet. By the way, your other question, re the collapse of globalization, if it happened, would it be good for local economies, making them more self-reliant? Well, maybe good for some, but good for local economies worldwide? Almost certainly the exact opposite. Bear in mind that when we had a lot more constraints on international trade before globalization had really geared up in the 1970s, the early 1980s, we had a very clear rich world and a poor world. Two distinct groups. A poor world largely festering in poverty, loaded down with debt and going nowhere but down. Not the definition of healthy local economies. Globalization kick-started the process with all sorts of benefits and negative consequences, of course, bundled in. But nevertheless, it kick-started the process of moving all those developing countries into an upward process. Local markets can work, I suppose, if you have geographical, demographical, resource allocative and agricultural self-reliance. Strict autarky, where you try to produce everything you need yourself, has a really bad historical track record of doing anything other than producing grinding poverty. Global trade, where people more easily able to produce something, do so and sell it to the rest of us, has been much more effective. Yes, there are consequences and externalities you have to solve for. Those are more easily addressed with the wealth that you create. I don't believe in being ideological about this, but I'm not aware of any examples from history of modern societies free from desperate poverty, wholly thriving as purely local economies and with short supply chains. There are elements you could certainly promote, like a more seasonal approach to what we eat. As a Brit, I look with envy at the food culture of, for example, the Italians, which operate thriving markets of local produce upon which are shaped many of the daily staple dishes that they eat. But I also notice that those societies are changing. They are losing that beneficial culture that came about largely through necessity, because ultimately people given the choice will choose more variation. Is that a good thing? No, I don't think it is, but it's happening. So you can only reinforce that increased emphasis on localism by forcing people to accept what they naturally do not choose when given the choice. That is a tricky proposition at best if you're a society that believes in population consent for how it's governed, which we still do, I hope. But in any case, as I've just said before, don't go to the extremes. The tide of globalization may ebb and flow, but even if the mood music changes significantly, you'll find there's still a huge amount of global trade quietly going on regardless. Alright, thanks to my Patreon supporter Bernard for that question. If you would like to help make these videos possible, please do consider joining the community of people that support me there, which you can do by heading on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.